The sky was an ominous shade of gray, a swirling tempest of clouds that seemed to smother the horizon. The roar of rushing water echoed through the valley as the flood surged forward with relentless fury. Mud, branches, and debris churned violently in its wake, turning the once serene landscape into a chaotic nightmare. Among the tumult, a loyal German shepherd named Rex paddled desperately, his golden fur slick and matted from the driving rain and the muddy torrent that sought to pull him under. The current was merciless, tugging at Rex with a strength that felt insurmountable. His legs flailed in the water, the powerful strokes of his limbs weakening with every passing second. His chest heaved, the cold, murky water pressing against his lungs, making every breath a struggle. Around him, trees were uprooted and dragged downstream like twigs, their snapping trunks and branches forming a cacophony of destruction. Each sound reverberated through Rex's ears, adding to his fear. A piece of shattered wood slammed into his side, eliciting a sharp yelp of pain. He was briefly submerged, the icy water engulfing him. Panic clawed at his instincts as he fought to resurface, his jaws snapping at the air as if to grasp something tangible amidst the chaos. His brown eyes, usually warm and confident, were now wide with terror, darting in every direction for a sign of solid ground, a sanctuary from this watery prison. The rain continued to fall in sheets, blurring Rex's vision. His fur felt impossibly heavy, soaked through and laden with the weight of the deluge. Each kick of his hind legs grew slower, the strength sapped by the unyielding cold that seeped into his bones. His paws scrabbled at floating bits of debris, only to find no purchase, the slick surfaces betraying him. A loud crash sounded nearby, a massive tree splitting and collapsing into the water. The wave it created surged toward Rex, lifting him momentarily before pulling him down into the swirling depths. His tail trailed behind him like a flag of surrender, and his heart pounded in his chest, a frantic rhythm that seemed to match the torrent's pace. His ears, flat against his skull, were filled with the deafening roar of the flood. The once familiar valley had transformed into an alien, inhospitable world, and Rex was its unwilling prisoner. Through the haze of rain and debris, Rex caught sight of a partially submerged car, its roof just barely visible above the waterline. It was a glimmer of hope, a chance to rest his weary legs. With a burst of determination, he paddled toward it, his body trembling from exertion. The current pushed back, a force of nature intent on keeping him from salvation. Gritting his teeth in a silent snarl, Rex fought harder, his claws slicing through the water as he clawed his way closer. As he neared the car, his front paws found the edge of the roof, and he hauled himself up with what little strength he had left. His body trembled violently, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The water lapped hungrily at the car's roof, threatening to pull him back into its clutches. His claws scrabbled for grip against the slick metal, the sound a pitiful reminder of his vulnerability. He let out a low whine, his voice barely audible over the storm's fury. From his precarious perch, Rex scanned the horizon, searching desperately for any sign of his family. The house where he had spent his life, the people who had loved and cared for him, were nowhere in sight. Instead, the valley stretched out before him, a churning sea of mud and water that seemed to go on forever. The once lush green fields were buried beneath layers of sludge, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and despair. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the valley in a brief, blinding flash. In that moment, Rex saw the shattered remnants of a barn drifting past, its splintered wood a testament to the flood's destructive power. A sobering thought took root in his mind. He was truly alone, a single, fragile life caught in the grip of an unstoppable force. The roof of the car shuddered beneath him as the current shifted, threatening to dislodge him. Rex's claws dug into the metal with renewed urgency, a desperate attempt to hold on. His muscles burned with exhaustion, his breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Every instinct screamed at him to keep fighting, but his body betrayed him, the fatigue sapping his strength and his will. The water surged again, and Rex lost his grip. With a yelp of terror, he was swept back into the flood, the icy grip of the current wrapping around him like a vice. He paddled feebly, his movements sluggish and uncoordinated. His head dipped below the surface, and for a terrifying moment, he was surrounded by nothing but darkness and cold. The world above felt impossibly far away, a distant memory that he could no longer reach. But Rex was not one to give up. With a final, desperate effort, he pushed himself upward, breaking the surface with a sputtering gasp. His ears were flat against his skull, and his eyes burned with a mixture of salt and desperation. He was weak, his body trembling uncontrollably, but his spirit refused to be extinguished. He paddled onward, his movements slower and more labored, each stroke of his limbs a battle against the inevitable. The storm raged on, its fury unrelenting. Rex's world was a blur of water and chaos, a symphony of destruction that seemed to echo his own despair. But amidst the hopelessness, there was a flicker of resilience, a glimmer of the loyalty and determination that defined him. For even as the flood sought to claim him, Rex continued to fight, his heart beating with a stubborn refusal to surrender. The storm raged on, hammering the windshield of Daniel's old truck with relentless fury. The wipers struggled to keep up, smearing the rain into uneven streaks that blurred the chaotic scene outside. Daniel sat motionless, his hands gripping the steering wheel. His truck, a battered relic of his years as a firefighter, had become his sanctuary. The storm outside mirrored the turbulence within him, a relentless deluge of memories and regrets that he had buried but never escaped. He should have been home, sitting in the quiet solitude he had chosen after walking away from everything that once defined him. But something had drawn him out tonight, an unspoken pull that he couldn't explain. Now, parked on the shoulder of the road overlooking the valley, he stared out into the floodwaters churning below. The river had broken its banks, transforming the landscape into a swirling sea of mud and destruction. A flash of lightning illuminated the valley for a fleeting moment, and Daniel's eyes caught movement in the water. At first, it seemed like debris, a branch or some other piece of wreckage carried by the current. But then it shifted, struggling against the relentless pull of the flood. He squinted through the rain, leaning forward. The shape moved again, and his heart sank as he realized what it was. A dog. It was fighting to stay afloat, its soaked fur plastered to its thin frame. Its head bobbed above the surface, struggling to keep out of the water as the current tossed it like a rag doll. Daniel's chest tightened. He could see the desperation in the animal's movements, the hopeless battle it was waging against forces far greater than itself. The sight dragged him out of his numb detachment, igniting a spark of something he thought he had buried long ago. "No," he muttered to himself, his knuckles whitening on the wheel. "Don't do it. Stay out of it." He had promised himself. After the fire that took his best friend and nearly claimed his own life, he had vowed to never again step into danger. He had walked away from his career, his community, and even his own family to escape the guilt that clung to him like smoke. The heroism others had seen in him had felt like a lie, and he had sworn off ever trying to save anyone again. But the dog was still there, fighting for its life, its legs paddling frantically against the inevitable. Daniel could see the moment its strength began to falter, its head dipping lower into the water, the current dragging it further away. It wouldn't last much longer. The dog's struggle wasn't just a cry for help, it was a mirror of his own. He slammed his fist against the steering wheel, cursing under his breath. His heart was pounding, his mind racing through the excuses he had told himself to stay detached. "It's just a dog," he whispered, trying to convince himself. But the words felt hollow. Before he knew it, he was out of the truck, the freezing rain pelting him as he ran toward the edge of the water. The cold bit through his jacket, soaking him to the bone in seconds, but he didn't care. His boots sank into the mud, the slippery ground nearly pulling him down as he reached the flood's edge. The dog was closer now, its body barely visible amid the debris-laden torrent. Its eyes met his for a split second, a flash of fear, pain, and desperation. Daniel's chest tightened further, his breath catching. He knew that look. He had seen it before in the faces of people he couldn't save. Not this time. Without another thought, he plunged into the water. The icy current hit him like a freight train, stealing his breath and dragging him under. The weight of his soaked clothes made every movement a battle, the cold seeping into his muscles and slowing him down. His arms clawed at the water, his legs kicking furiously as he fought to resurface. When his head broke the surface, he gasped for air, coughing as he was pulled downstream. The dog was just ahead, its movements weaker now, its head barely above the waterline. Daniel pushed himself forward, his arms burning with effort. The current dragged him sideways, slamming him into a chunk of debris that scraped painfully across his ribs. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to keep going. "Hang on," he shouted, though his voice was lost in the roar of the flood. He wasn't sure if he was yelling at the dog or at himself. His fingers finally brushed against the dog's fur, and he lunged forward, grabbing hold of its collar. The animal let out a weak yelp, its body trembling violently. Daniel wrapped his arm around it, holding it against his chest as he fought to stay afloat. The current was relentless, pulling them both toward the center of the flood. He spotted an uprooted tree wedged against a boulder, its twisted branches forming a temporary barrier. Gritting his teeth, he kicked toward it, each stroke a monumental effort against the cold and the current. The dog squirmed weakly in his grip, its paws scraping at his chest in fear. "Hold still," he growled, though his voice was shaking from the cold. "I've got you." Reaching the tree, he hooked his arm around a branch, his muscles screaming in protest as he fought to hold on. The water surged around them, threatening to tear them away. He could feel the bark digging into his skin, the sharp edges scraping his arm, but he held on. The dog clung to him now, its claws digging into his jacket as it whimpered pitifully. Daniel's vision blurred, the rain and exhaustion combining into a haze that threatened to overwhelm him. His breaths came in ragged gasps, each one a battle against the cold tightening around his chest. He could feel his strength fading, the current tugging harder with each passing second. But then he spotted a glimmer of hope, a patch of higher ground just a few yards away. The water was shallower there, the current slower. If he could just reach it, they might have a chance. "Come on," he muttered through gritted teeth. "Just a little more." Using the tree for leverage, he pushed off, dragging himself and the dog toward the shallows. The mud sucked at his boots, threatening to pull him under, but he kept going. His legs felt like lead, his arms trembling with exhaustion as he staggered onto the higher ground. He collapsed onto his knees, the dog slipping from his grasp and collapsing beside him. They were both shaking uncontrollably, their breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The rain continued to pour, soaking them further, but the floodwaters had been left behind. Daniel looked down at the dog, its chest heaving as it tried to recover. Its eyes met his again, and this time there was no fear, only gratitude. He let out a shaky laugh, his body trembling from more than just the cold. "Guess we're both still here," he muttered, running a hand through his soaked hair. For the first time in years, Daniel felt something other than guilt. It wasn't triumph or even relief. It was the faintest flicker of purpose, a reminder of the man he used to be. The storm lashed against the truck as Daniel flung the door open, rain slicing through the air like shards of glass. He could feel the cold before he even stepped out, a bitter chill that seemed to pierce his skin. His boots splashed into the muddy ground as he sprinted toward the raging flood. The roar of the water was deafening, drowning out every rational thought, every excuse he might have clung to that told him to stay out of this. All that remained was the sight of the dog, barely afloat, its head bobbing weakly above the churning surface. Rex's golden fur was slicked to his frail body, the river swallowing him inch by inch. His paws thrashed feebly, no longer able to fight the current that dragged him towards certain death. His mouth opened in silent gasps, his body jerking with the last remnants of strength. Each time he sank beneath the water, it was longer before he re-emerged, sputtering and shivering, his eyes wide with terror. The dog's will to live burned bright, but his body was losing the battle. Daniel's breath came in short, visible puffs as he reached the edge of the floodwaters. The icy river surged before him, a raging torrent of mud and debris. Chunks of wood, pieces of fences, and even the twisted remains of a wagon were swept past, all carried by the relentless force of the flood. He hesitated for half a second, long enough for the enormity of the danger to grip him. The current was ferocious, and the water was frigid enough to kill a man in minutes. But then Rex's head went under again, and something in Daniel snapped. "Hold on," he shouted, though the words were more for himself than the dog. With a deep breath, he plunged into the water. The cold hit him like 1,000 knives, stealing the air from his lungs. His body stiffened instinctively, his limbs refusing to obey as the current grabbed hold of him and dragged him under. The murky water enveloped him, pressing in on all sides as if trying to crush him. He kicked frantically, his arms clawing at the water until his head broke the surface. He gasped for air, the rain pelting his face as he fought to keep his bearings. The current was merciless, pulling him downstream and slamming him into a tangle of branches. Pain shot through his ribs as the jagged wood scraped against him, but he pushed off, gritting his teeth against the sting. Rex was ahead, no more than 20 feet away, but it felt like an impossible distance. The dog had resurfaced, his body limp and drifting closer to the debris-strewn heart of the flood. Daniel's arms burned as he paddled toward him, each stroke a battle against the water that seemed intent on pulling him under. "Come on," he growled through clenched teeth, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Just a little further." Rex's head dipped below the surface again, and this time it didn't come back up. Panic surged through Daniel as he kicked harder, the icy water sapping his strength with every movement. He reached out blindly, his fingers searching for anything solid. Then, just as his lungs screamed for air, he felt fur brush against his hand. He grabbed hold of Rex's collar, his fingers slipping on the wet leather as he hauled the dog upward. Rex emerged from the water with a choking gasp, his body trembling violently. The dog's eyes met Daniel's, wide with a mixture of terror and faint hope. The weight of the animal, combined with the strength of the current, nearly pulled them both under, but Daniel refused to let go. His muscles screamed in protest as he wrapped an arm around Rex, holding the dog tightly against his chest. The river showed no mercy. The current tore at them, dragging them downstream and slamming them into a broken tree trunk that jutted from the water like a spear. The impact knocked the wind out of Daniel, and he felt his grip on Rex falter. Pain shot through his side as a branch gouged his ribs, but he clung to the tree, his free hand clutching at the rough bark. "Stay with me," he muttered, his voice hoarse and trembling. "Don't give up now." Rex let out a weak whimper, his body limp in Daniel's arms. The dog's breaths were shallow, each one a struggle against the cold and exhaustion. Daniel scanned the water, his heart pounding as he searched for something, anything, that could help them. Then he saw it, a large piece of debris, part of what looked like a shattered barn door, floating a few yards away. It was their only chance. Gritting his teeth, Daniel pushed off the tree, dragging Rex with him as he fought his way toward the debris. The current pushed back, dragging them sideways and threatening to pull them under. His legs felt like lead, his arms trembling with the effort of holding on to both the dog and his own life. Every inch was a battle, every breath a struggle against the icy grip of the water. Finally, his fingers found the edge of the floating door. He hooked his arm over it, pulling himself and Rex onto the makeshift raft. The wood creaked under their weight, water sloshing over the edges as the current carried them downstream. Daniel collapsed onto his back, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. Rex lay beside him, shivering uncontrollably but alive. The relief was short-lived. The debris was barely stable, tilting dangerously with every shift of the current. Daniel forced himself to sit up, his hands gripping the edges as he tried to steady them. His body ached, the cold seeping into his bones, but he couldn't afford to rest. The river wasn't done with them yet. Ahead, he saw the outline of a partially submerged fence, the jagged wood protruding from the water like the teeth of a trap. The current was carrying them straight toward it, and there was no way to avoid the collision. Daniel braced himself, wrapping his arms around Rex as the raft slammed into the fence. The impact nearly threw them off, the sharp wood splintering beneath them. Pain flared in his shoulder as a piece of the fence scraped across his skin, but he held on. The raft teetered, threatening to capsize. Water poured over the sides, soaking them further as Daniel struggled to keep them balanced. Rex whimpered, his claws scrabbling at the wet wood as he tried to find a stable position. Daniel reached out, steadying the dog with one hand while gripping the fence with the other. The debris shifted again, the current tugging at it relentlessly. Not yet, Daniel muttered, his breath coming in ragged gasps. We're not done yet. Summoning the last of his strength, he pulled Rex closer, using the fence to guide them toward the riverbank. The journey felt endless, every second a test of his resolve. But finally, mercifully, the water began to shallow. The raft scraped against the muddy ground, and Daniel collapsed onto his knees, pulling Rex with him. They were alive. Soaked, battered, and exhausted, but alive. Daniel sat back, his chest heaving as he cradled Rex in his arms. The dog's eyes met his once more, and this time there was no fear, only gratitude. The storm still raged around them, but for the first time, Daniel felt a flicker of warmth in the cold. Daniel lay sprawled in the mud, his chest heaving as he gulped air into his burning lungs. The patch of land beneath him was little more than a strip of submerged mud and debris, barely breaking the surface of the floodwaters. The rain still hammered down, relentless and cold, mixing with the sweat and blood streaked across his face. His soaked clothes clung to him like a second skin, heavy and suffocating. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, and the sharp sting in his shoulder reminded him of the jagged fence he'd collided with minutes earlier. Beside him, Rex lay motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. The dog's fur was matted and slick with mud, his eyes half closed. Each breath was weak, rattling faintly as it passed through his body. The loyal dog that had fought so fiercely to survive the flood was now teetering on the brink. Daniel felt a pang of guilt stab through him as he reached out to place a trembling hand on Rex's side. "Hang in there, buddy," he whispered, his voice hoarse and shaky. "I didn't drag you out of that water just for you to give up on me now." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Daniel himself was barely holding on. His limbs felt like lead, every ounce of strength drained from him by the freezing flood. The storm around them showed no sign of letting up, and the floodwaters continued to surge angrily, threatening to swallow even this precarious patch of land. But as he stared at Rex's fragile form, something inside him hardened. He couldn't leave the dog here, not after everything they'd just been through. Daniel dragged himself into a sitting position, the mud sucking at his hands and knees as he moved. He looked around, trying to gauge his surroundings. The flood stretched in every direction, a merciless sea of debris and destruction. The only landmark in sight was a distant line of trees, their tops barely visible through the rain. If there was solid ground anywhere, it would be there. His mind raced, weighing his options. Staying here wasn't one of them. The flood would consume this tiny patch of land within minutes, and the cold would finish them off soon after. He had to move no matter how impossible it felt. He had to carry Rex to safety. "You've been through worse," he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the storm. "You've gotten out of worse." But even as he said it, the memories he'd tried so hard to suppress surged back with cruel clarity. The fire that had taken his best friend. The choking smoke, the unbearable heat, and the crushing weight of failure. He shook his head violently, trying to push the thoughts away. This wasn't the time to drown in the past. Rex needed him now, and for once, he wouldn't fail. Gritting his teeth, Daniel reached for Rex, sliding his hands under the dog's soaked body. Rex whimpered weakly, his head lolling to one side as Daniel lifted him. The dog was heavier than he looked, his drenched fur adding to the weight. Daniel's arms screamed in protest, his injured shoulder flaring with fresh pain, but he refused to let go. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his voice trembling. "I've got you. I'm not letting you go." Standing was an ordeal. The mud sucked at his boots, and the weight of Rex made his legs wobble like they might give out at any moment. The rain lashed against his face, blurring his vision as he staggered to his feet. Every step felt like a battle as he turned toward the distant line of trees and began to move. The current fought him every inch of the way, the floodwaters swirling around his knees and threatening to pull him off balance. Debris floated past, sharp edges glinting in the dim light, each piece a potential hazard. His grip on Rex was slippery, his fingers numb from the cold, but he held on with a determination that bordered on desperation. The rain pounded harder, and the wind howled in his ears. The water rose to his thighs, its icy grip tightening around him. He could feel his strength ebbing with every step, his legs trembling under the combined weight of the dog and his own exhaustion. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. "You've got to make it," he whispered through gritted teeth, more to himself than to Rex. "You don't get to quit now." The humiliation of his situation wasn't lost on him. A man once hailed as a hero, reduced to stumbling through a flood with a dog in his arms, fighting for survival against odds that felt insurmountable. But Daniel didn't care. He'd given up on being a hero long ago. All that mattered now was getting Rex to safety. His foot snagged on something underwater, a root or a piece of debris, and he stumbled, nearly falling. The sudden jolt sent a searing pain through his shoulder, and for a terrifying moment he thought he might lose his grip on Rex. But he managed to stay upright, tightening his hold on the dog as he pushed forward. The line of trees loomed closer now, their skeletal forms standing defiant against the flood. The water shallowed slightly as he neared, giving him a faint glimmer of hope. But the mud was thicker here, clinging to his boots and pulling him down with every step. His breaths came in ragged gasps, each one a struggle against the cold that gnawed at his chest. Finally, he reached the base of the nearest tree, its roots partially submerged but offering a sliver of solid ground. Daniel collapsed against the trunk, his legs giving out beneath him. He cradled Rex in his arms, the dog's body limp but still breathing. The small victory felt monumental, a flicker of light in the darkness that surrounded them. But they weren't safe yet. The floodwaters continued to rise, lapping at the base of the tree as if eager to claim them. Daniel looked up, his vision blurred by rain and exhaustion. The only way to escape the water was to climb. "You're kidding me," he muttered, staring at the slick, rain-soaked bark. But there was no other choice. Gritting his teeth, he shifted Rex's weight, hoisting the dog onto his shoulder. His injured arm screamed in protest, but he ignored it, focusing on the task at hand. He reached for the lowest branch, his fingers slipping on the wet bark before finally finding a grip. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to climb. The ascent was brutal. Every muscle in his body ached, and the added weight of Rex made every movement a test of endurance. The tree swayed under the force of the wind, its branches slick and unsteady. Twice, his foot slipped, sending him and Rex lurching dangerously. But each time, he regained his balance, refusing to let go. At last, he reached a sturdy branch high enough to stay above the rising floodwaters. He collapsed onto it, his back against the trunk as he cradled Rex in his lap. The dog's breathing was faint but steady, his body trembling against Daniel's chest. They were safe, for now. The flood raged below them, an unrelenting force of nature that seemed determined to consume everything in its path. But Daniel held onto Rex, his arms wrapped protectively around the dog. For the first time in years, he felt something stir within him, a fragile sense of purpose, born from the simple act of saving a life. The rain fell harder, each droplet stinging like icy needles against Daniel's skin. The wind howled through the skeletal branches of the trees, bending them to its will as the floodwaters continued to surge below. The small reprieve atop the tree had given him time to breathe, but Daniel knew it was no sanctuary. The water was still rising, swallowing more of the land with every passing minute. If they didn't move soon, they'd both be swept away. Rex lay limp in his lap, his body trembling with exhaustion and cold. His breathing was faint, each rise and fall of his chest a struggle. Daniel ran a hand over the dog's fur, which was still slick and matted with mud. He felt the animal's ribs beneath his fingers, a stark reminder of how frail Rex had become in the fight against the flood. They couldn't stay here, not if either of them wanted to live. "Come on, buddy," Daniel murmured, his voice hoarse. "We've got to keep going. I'm not leaving you here." With painstaking effort, Daniel shifted Rex off his lap and leaned him gently against the tree trunk. His own body protested the movement, muscles aching and shoulders burning from the weight of the climb. His soaked clothes felt like a leaden cloak, dragging him down with every move. But none of it mattered. He wasn't done yet. Scanning his surroundings, Daniel's eyes caught sight of something caught in the branches above, a tangled mess of wires, likely debris from a nearby utility pole. It was frayed and twisted, but it was something he could use. He reached for it, his fingers scraping against the rough bark as he stretched to untangle the wires. It took several attempts and a good deal of cursing before he finally managed to free the length of wire. His hands trembling with cold and fatigue, Daniel fashioned a crude leash from the wire. He formed a loose loop, careful not to make it too tight, and slipped it gently around Rex's neck. The dog didn't resist, his eyes barely open as he leaned against the tree. The leash wasn't perfect, it wasn't even close to ideal, but it was all Daniel had, and it would have to do. "All right, Rex," Daniel said, tightening his grip on the wire. "Let's get out of here." Sliding down the tree was harder than climbing up. The bark was slick with rain, and his boots struggled to find purchase on the narrow branches. With Rex in tow, every movement felt like it could be their last. Twice, he lost his footing, his heart lurching as they slipped dangerously close to falling. But somehow, miraculously, they made it back to the muddy ground. The water was colder than ever, a biting chill that wrapped around Daniel's legs and sent a shiver up his spine. The current was stronger now, swirling with debris that threatened to sweep them away at any moment. But he pushed forward, gripping the wire leash with one hand and keeping Rex close by his side. The dog stumbled with every step, his legs weak and unsteady, but he didn't stop. Daniel's quiet encouragement, urgent whispers of "you can do it" and "just a little farther," seemed to fuel him, giving him the strength to move forward. The first major obstacle came in the form of a floating log, its massive frame twisting through the current like a battering ram. Daniel saw it too late. The log slammed into his side, knocking him off balance and sending him sprawling into the water. His grip on the wire leash slipped, and for a terrifying moment he thought he'd lost Rex. Scrambling to his knees, his hands frantically searched for the dog. "Rex," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Where are you?" A weak whimper answered him, and he turned to see Rex struggling to stay afloat, the wire leash tangled around a chunk of debris. With a burst of adrenaline, Daniel lunged forward, grabbing the wire and freeing Rex from the tangle. He hauled the dog close, wrapping an arm around him as the current tugged at them both. "Not on my watch," Daniel muttered, his jaw clenched. "You're not going anywhere." The journey continued, each step more grueling than the last. The water was now up to Daniel's waist, the current pressing against him with unrelenting force. Every few yards, another obstacle emerged, a sharp piece of wood, a swirling eddy that threatened to drag them under, or a jagged piece of metal jutting from the floodwaters. Daniel's hands were raw, his fingers numb from gripping the wire leash and pulling Rex along. The humiliation of the situation gnawed at him. Once, he'd been a firefighter, a man people looked up to, someone who ran into danger to save others. Now he was reduced to this, staggering through a flood with a dog clinging to life, barely able to keep himself upright. The irony wasn't lost on him, and it stung like a fresh wound. But even as his mind spiraled into self-recrimination, his body kept moving. His will to save Rex was stronger than his self-pity. "Keep going," he said aloud, his voice firm despite the exhaustion weighing it down. One step at a time. Rex stumbled again, his legs giving out as the dog collapsed into the water. Daniel cursed, pulling the dog upright with the leash. Rex let out a weak yelp, his body trembling as he tried to stand. Daniel dropped to his knees beside him, his hands steadying the dog. "You've made it this far," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "Don't quit on me now, Rex. You're stronger than this." The dog's eyes met his, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something, a faint spark of determination. With a low whine, Rex pushed himself to his feet, his legs wobbling but holding. Daniel smiled grimly, his chest tightening with relief. "That's it," he said, standing and gripping the leash once more. "We're almost there." The line of trees in the distance grew closer with each agonizing step. The ground beneath the floodwaters began to rise, the current losing some of its strength. Daniel could feel the exhaustion pulling at him, his legs barely responding, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. But the sight of solid ground ahead kept him moving. Finally, mercifully, they reached the edge of the flood. Daniel stumbled onto dry land, collapsing onto his hands and knees as the rain poured over him. Rex lay beside him, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. They were both soaked, battered, and utterly spent, but they were alive. Daniel dropped the wire leash, his hands trembling as he reached out to run a hand over Rex's fur. The dog's eyes fluttered open, and he let out a faint whine, leaning into Daniel's touch. "We made it," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking. "We actually made it." The rain finally eased to a steady drizzle as Daniel and Rex collapsed onto the small patch of dry ground, a sanctuary carved out in the chaos of the flood. The world around them was quiet now, save for the distant roar of water and the occasional groan of debris being carried downstream. The patch of earth beneath them was firm but soaked, clinging to Daniel's hands and knees as he struggled to stay upright. Every muscle in his body ached, his limbs trembling with exhaustion, and his breath came in shallow gasps. Beside him, Rex lay sprawled on his side, his chest rising and falling unevenly. Daniel glanced at the dog, his hand reaching out instinctively to rest on Rex's soaked fur. The animal flinched slightly but didn't pull away, his body too weak to resist. For a moment, Daniel feared Rex wouldn't make it. His breathing was shallow, his eyes half-lidded, and his body shivered uncontrollably from the cold. But then Rex let out a faint whimper, his tail giving the smallest twitch, and Daniel felt a flicker of relief. He was alive. Barely, but alive. Daniel sat back, wiping his muddy hands on his soaked jeans, though it did little to clean them. His mind raced despite the exhaustion threatening to pull him under. The hours of battling the floodwaters had left him battered and raw, both physically and emotionally. His body bore the marks of the ordeal, cuts and scrapes on his arms, a deep bruise forming on his ribs, and the relentless sting of cold. But the bruises inside him, the ones he had carried for years, felt different now. Something about the dog lying next to him, this loyal, brave creature who had fought so hard to survive, stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years. He couldn't look at Rex without thinking of the fire. The memory slammed into him with the force of a flood. The heat, the smoke, the screams. His best friend, Mike, trapped inside, calling for help as Daniel's own lungs burned from the effort of carrying others out. And then the explosion. Daniel had tried to go back in, had begged to, but the flames had been too strong, the structure too unstable. He had been pulled away, his body screaming to fight, while the fire consumed everything behind him. Mike had been lost, and Daniel had never forgiven himself. But now, sitting here with Rex, something shifted. He had sworn never to save anyone again, to avoid the weight of being responsible for another life. And yet here he was, drenched and shivering, having risked his life to save a dog. Not because he had to, but because he couldn't look away. Because in Rex's desperate struggle, he saw himself. He saw the fight he thought he had lost. "You saved me too, didn't you?" Daniel murmured, his voice hoarse. Rex's eyes flicked toward him, and the dog let out a soft huff, his body shifting slightly as if trying to get closer. The gesture was so small, so subtle, but it struck Daniel harder than anything had in years. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the wall he had built around himself cracked. The storm finally broke, the drizzle easing to a faint mist as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. The floodwaters had receded slightly, though the ground around them was still a treacherous, muddy wasteland. Daniel knew they couldn't stay here. He had to get Rex to warmth, to food, to safety. But moving felt impossible. His legs were leaden, his arms weak, and his mind teetered on the edge of shutting down completely. He stared at the ground for what felt like hours, his thoughts a haze of exhaustion and guilt. Finally, with a groan, he pushed himself to his feet. His body protested every movement, his ribs flaring with pain, but he ignored it. They weren't out of the woods yet. Rex stirred as Daniel knelt down beside him, his brown eyes blinking open slowly. The dog's ears twitched, and his tail gave another weak wag. "Come on, boy," Daniel said softly, slipping his arms under Rex's body. "Just a little farther. We're almost home." Lifting Rex was agony. The dog wasn't heavy, but Daniel's body was at its limit, every muscle screaming in protest as he cradled Rex against his chest. His injured shoulder throbbed, and his legs wobbled beneath him, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. One step at a time, he began the slow, painful journey out of the flood zone. The walk was grueling. The mud sucked at his boots, threatening to pull him down with every step. The cold gnawed at his exposed skin, and his vision swam from exhaustion. Several times he stumbled, nearly dropping Rex, but each time he caught himself, his grip tightening on the dog. He muttered encouragement to Rex as they went, his voice a low, steady murmur that was as much for himself as for the dog. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Daniel saw it, the faint outline of his truck, parked on a slight rise just beyond the worst of the floodwaters. The sight of it filled him with a surge of relief so strong it nearly brought him to his knees. With one last burst of strength, he pushed forward, his boots slipping on the muddy incline as he climbed toward the vehicle. Reaching the truck, Daniel eased Rex onto the passenger seat, wrapping an old blanket he found behind the seat around the dog's trembling body. Rex let out a low whine, his eyes fluttering shut as he nestled into the warmth. Daniel collapsed into the driver's seat, his head falling back against the headrest as he let out a shaky breath. They were safe. For the first time in hours, Daniel felt the tension in his chest ease. He sat there for a long moment, the truck's interior silent except for the sound of Rex's breathing. The bond between them was unspoken but undeniable. They had survived together, and now, as Daniel looked at the dog curled up beside him, he knew he couldn't let go. When they finally reached his small, weathered home on the edge of town, Daniel carried Rex inside, careful not to jostle the dog too much. He laid Rex on the old couch, piling blankets around him before lighting the wood stove to fill the room with warmth. For the next few hours, Daniel busied himself tending to Rex's injuries, wiping the mud from his fur, and coaxing him to take small sips of water. The dog responded weakly but willingly, his trust in Daniel unshakable. As the fire crackled and the room filled with warmth, Daniel sank into a chair beside the couch, his eyes heavy with exhaustion but his heart lighter than it had been in years. Rex was more than just a dog. He was a survivor, a fighter, and now, a companion. Daniel didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something close to hope. "You're not going anywhere," Daniel said softly, reaching out to rest a hand on Rex's head. The dog's tail thumped weakly against the couch, and Daniel smiled, a real, genuine smile. This wasn't just the end of a harrowing night. It was the beginning of something new. The second chance, for both of them. ChatGPT